The scent of lilies filled the air as I stood by Richard's casket, clutching my pearls so tightly they might have snapped. Everyone said how strong I was, how composed I looked. But inside I felt like a fragile vase on the edge of a table moments away from shattering. I had spent 45 years loving him, building a life with him, and now here I was, saying goodbye to the man who had promised me forever. But what no one knew, not even the mourners whispering condolences behind their hands, was that my heart wasn't breaking just because he was gone. It was breaking because I didn't know him at all. That's when she walked in. She slipped through the heavy wooden doors of the funeral home like a shadow you can't quite shake, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Her name was Serafina Langley, or at least that's what she told me later, and she carried herself with an elegance that made my own carefully chosen black dress feel drab. When our eyes met across the room, something in her gaze stopped me cold. It wasn't pity or guilt, it was confidence. And then it hit me, this woman wasn't here by accident. She wasn't a distant relative or a forgotten friend. No, Serafina was here for him. I sat stiffly in the lawyer's office, the leather chair creaking beneath me as I tried to steady my breathing. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, but the air felt suffocating. Across from me, Serafina perched elegantly, her fingers intertwined as if she belonged there more than I did. Every glance she gave me felt like a dagger twisting deeper into my chest. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to remember who I was. A dignified widow, not some scorned wife out of a tawdry novel. But when Mr. Whitaker, the lawyer, cleared his throat and began reading Richard's will, I realized calmness wasn't an option anymore. To my beloved Eleanor, he read aloud, his voice steady and professional, I leave the memories we shared and the hope that you find peace in the years ahead. My jaw tightened. Memories? Peace? What kind of hollow words were these? Then came the part that knocked the breath out of me. To Serafina Langley, my dearest companion, I bequeath half of my estate, including the family home, which has been a sanctuary for us both. Half of his estate. Our home. The place where I raised our children, where I'd cooked countless dinners, where I thought I'd grow old. I stared at the paper in disbelief, feeling the walls close in around me. How could he do this? How could he betray me so completely? That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too empty without Richard's snores echoing down the hallway. Instead of lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I found myself drawn to his study, the one room he always insisted remain off-limits to me. It was ridiculous, really. After 45 years of marriage, shouldn't I have known better than to respect such boundaries? But tonight I didn't care about boundaries. Tonight I needed answers. The desk drawer stuck slightly as I pulled it open, revealing a dusty shoebox tucked underneath piles of papers. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, and there it was, proof of everything I'd feared. Photographs of Richard and Serafina together, smiling like fools on some sun-drenched beach. Love letters written in her delicate handwriting, each one signed with a flourish. Forever yours, Sarah. I felt sick, like the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand. Who was this woman? Who was my husband? And why hadn't I seen any of this coming? By morning I knew I couldn't face this alone. I hired a private investigator, a wiry man named Leo Kane with sharp eyes and a cigarette habit, to dig deeper into Richard's affairs. He promised discretion, but I didn't care who knew at that point. Let the whole world see what kind of man Richard Hawthorne really was. Over coffee at a dingy diner 2 towns over, Leo laid out his findings. Secret bank accounts, lavish gifts purchased for Serafina, even a lease agreement for an apartment in Boston under Richard's name. Each revelation felt like another blow to my already battered heart. You sure you want to keep going with this? Leo asked, stubbing out his cigarette in the ashtray. His tone was casual, but his eyes betrayed concern. I nodded curtly, refusing to let doubt creep in. Of course I wanted to keep going. I had to know the full extent of Richard's betrayal. But as I left the diner, clutching the folder of evidence, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind. Was I seeking justice or revenge? 2 days later I spotted Serafina sitting at a corner table in the town's only cafe, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone. Something inside me snapped. I marched over, pulling out the chair opposite her without asking permission. We need to talk, I said, my voice low but firm. She looked up, startled, then gave me a small, sad smile. You're Eleanor, right? She asked, setting her cup down. Richard spoke about you often. Her words hit me like a slap. Spoke about me? As if I were some distant acquaintance rather than his wife? I leaned forward, my anger bubbling over. Did he also tell you about the life we built together? About the promises he broke? Her expression softened, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But instead she simply said, "He loved us both, Eleanor. In his own flawed way." Flawed? The word echoed in my head long after I stormed out of the cafe, leaving behind a scene that would become the talk of the town for weeks. Serafina invited me to dinner later that week, a gesture I initially dismissed as absurd. Why would I willingly sit across from the woman who had stolen half of my life? But curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I was walking into a dimly lit Italian restaurant, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and dread. She greeted me warmly, her smile disarming but calculated, like she knew exactly how to play this game. "I thought we could clear the air," she said softly, pouring me a glass of wine. As the meal progressed, Serafina painted a picture of Richard the First barely recognized. She spoke of late-night conversations, shared dreams, and quiet moments that sounded achingly intimate. "He wasn't perfect," she admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "But he cared deeply about both of us." Her words made my skin crawl, not because they were untrue but because they felt too close to the truth. I wanted to hate her, to blame her entirely for the wreckage of my marriage, but as she spoke, I began to see cracks in the facade she presented. Was she as much a victim of Richard's lies as I was? Or was this just another manipulation? The next morning I couldn't shake the unease that lingered after dinner. Instead of letting it consume me, I decided to take control. Sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, I drafted an anonymous email to the editor of our local gossip column. Attached were copies of the photos and documents Leo had uncovered, proof of Richard's double life and his financial entanglement with Serafina. By noon the story broke, spreading like wildfire through the town. Headlines screamed about Richard Hawthorne's secret affair, painting Serafina as a gold digger who had preyed on a grieving widow's inheritance. At first, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction watching people whisper behind their hands whenever Serafina walked by. Strangers avoided her at the grocery store. Friends stopped returning her calls. But as the days passed, guilt began to creep in. I hadn't anticipated how vicious the backlash would be, or how much it would hurt to see someone else suffer under the weight of Richard's sins. Still, I told myself it was necessary. Justice always came at a price, didn't it? One afternoon, while browsing the aisles of the library, I ran into Sophie Langley, Serafina's teenage daughter. She looked so much like her mother, with the same sharp cheekbones and piercing green eyes, but there was something softer about her, something vulnerable. When she approached me hesitantly, clutching a book to her chest, I saw an opportunity. "You must have questions," I said gently, guiding her to a quiet corner. "About your mother, and my husband." Sophie nodded, her voice trembling as she confessed her confusion. "Mom says Dad loved her, but everyone keeps saying she ruined your family. What am I supposed to believe?" It was all I could do not to laugh bitterly. Ruin my family? As if Richard hadn't played an equal part in this mess. Instead, I leaned closer, planting seeds of doubt with careful precision. "Your mother is strong," I murmured, "but sometimes strength can look a lot like selfishness." Sophie frowned, clearly troubled, and I felt a pang of guilt, but only for a moment. After all, wasn't this exactly what Serafina deserved? With Sophie questioning her mother's integrity, I turned my attention to dismantling Serafina's livelihood. Through Leo, I discovered that she owned a small boutique downtown. A charming little shop filled with handmade scarves and artisanal candles. It was her pride and joy, the one thing she'd built entirely on her own. And I destroyed it piece by piece. Using forged documents, I tipped off creditors and suppliers, creating a cascade of legal issues that forced her to close the store within weeks. Watching her lock up the shop for the last time felt surreal. Part of me expected triumph, vindication, but instead I felt hollow. Standing across the street, hidden behind oversized sunglasses, I watched as Serafina hugged Sophie tightly, tears streaming down her face. For the first time I allowed myself to wonder, had I gone too far? Was this really justice, or just cruelty disguised as retribution? It didn't take long for Serafina to figure out who was behind the chaos. One evening she showed up unannounced at my doorstep, her usually polished appearance undone by exhaustion and fury. "How could you do this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "You think ruining my life will bring him back? We'll make any of this okay. Her words cut deeper than I expected, forcing me to confront the ugliness of what I'd done. For a moment I considered confessing everything, the anger, the pain, the jealousy that had driven me to such extremes. But pride held me back. You don't get to act like the victim here, I shot back, my tone icy. You took half of my life. This is just fair play. Serafina stared at me, her expression unreadable, then turned and walked away without another word. Watching her leave, I realized something terrible. I had become the very thing I despised. The days after Serafina's confrontation blurred together in a haze of guilt and restless nights. I had won, or so I told myself. Her boutique was closed, her reputation tarnished, and Sophie barely spoke to her anymore. But the victory felt hollow, like biting into chocolate only to find it filled with ash. Every creak of the floorboards in the empty house reminded me that I was alone, truly alone for the first time in decades. Richard's presence lingered everywhere. In the dent his favorite armchair left on the carpet, in the faint smell of his cologne still clinging to the closet. But instead of comfort, it brought only bitterness. I tried to distract myself by redecorating the family home, rearranging furniture and repainting walls as if erasing every trace of him would somehow erase the pain. But no matter how many coats of paint I applied, the cracks beneath the surface remained. One night as I sat in the dark staring at the fireplace, I realized I hadn't laughed in weeks. Not a real laugh, the kind that bubbles up uncontrollably. Instead there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. Was this what revenge cost? A life devoid of joy, where even victories tasted bitter. Sophie came to see me again, though not out of kindness. She arrived unannounced one rainy afternoon, her hair damp and her eyes blazing with accusation. "Why did you do it?" she demanded, standing in my doorway like an avenging angel. "Why did you destroy my mom's business? Did you think that would fix anything?" Her words hit me like a slap, forcing me to confront the wreckage I'd created. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I said weakly, but Sophie cut me off before I could finish. "You didn't care about me or anyone else. You just wanted to punish her because you're angry at him." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, I saw myself reflected in her anger. A woman consumed by grief and rage, lashing out blindly. When she finally turned to leave, slamming the door behind her, I sank onto the couch, trembling. Sophie's words haunted me long after she was gone. "You're angry at him." Was she right? Had I spent all this time blaming others for wounds that Richard himself had inflicted? A week later, I attended the annual charity gala hosted by the Women's League, hoping to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. Clad in a black velvet gown and clutching a glass of champagne, I wandered through the crowded ballroom, nodding politely at acquaintances who avoided meeting my eyes. The whispers followed me wherever I went. About the scandal, about Serafina, about the woman who had once been Eleanor Hawthorne but now seemed more like a cautionary tale. "Did you hear what she did?" someone murmured nearby, their voice barely audible over the clink of silverware. "Poor Serafina. She didn't deserve that." My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to keep smiling, to pretend I hadn't heard. Yet as I moved through the crowd, I noticed fewer hands extended in greeting, fewer invitations to join conversations. By the end of the evening, I found myself sitting alone at a table in the corner, watching couples dance under twinkling lights. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be ostracized, to become a pariah in your own community. That night I dreamed of Richard. He stood in the garden of our old home, dressed in the navy blazer he used to wear on special occasions. His face was lined with age, but his smile was warm and familiar. "Ellie," he said softly, reaching out to me. "Why are you doing this?" His question startled me awake, my heart racing as I sat upright in bed. The room was dark, silent except for the ticking of the clock on the nightstand. I buried my face in my hands, trying to shake the image of him from my mind. But his words lingered, echoing in the quiet. "Why are you doing this?" Was he accusing me, or pleading with me? The dream felt too vivid, too real, as if Richard himself were warning me against the path I'd chosen. As dawn broke, casting pale light across the room, I realized something terrible. I had spent months punishing others for Richard's betrayal, but perhaps the person I hated most was myself. Desperate for redemption, or maybe just peace, I decided to reach out to Serafina. I drove to her apartment, rehearsing apologies in my head, but when she answered the door, her expression stopped me cold. There was no anger in her eyes, only sadness, and it struck me harder than any accusation ever could. "I'm sorry," I began, my voice trembling. "For everything." But Serafina shook her head, cutting me off before I could continue. "I can forgive you, Eleanor," she said quietly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. What you did, it changed things. Forever." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. I wanted to argue, to explain, but deep down I knew she was right. Some wounds ran too deep to heal, even with forgiveness. As I walked back to my car, rain beginning to fall, I realized I might never escape the shadow of my own actions. In the weeks that followed, I withdrew further into myself, spending my days wandering aimlessly through the house or tending to the garden Richard had once loved. Neighbors stopped visiting and friends grew distant, their calls becoming less frequent until they stopped altogether. Even Sophie, who had once sought me out for answers, avoided me entirely. I told myself it didn't matter, that I preferred solitude, but the truth was loneliness gnawed at me like a persistent ache. One evening, as I sorted through old photo albums, I stumbled upon a picture of Richard and me on our wedding day. We looked so young, so hopeful, our smiles radiant with promise. For a moment I allowed myself to remember the man I had married. The man who had held my hand during thunderstorms and danced with me in the kitchen late at night. But then reality intruded, reminding me of the secrets he had kept, the lies he had told. Closing the album, I set it aside and stared out the window, wondering if I would ever find peace, or if I deserved to. It was a crisp autumn morning when Mr. Whitaker, the lawyer, called me into his office again. I had hoped this chapter of my life was closed, but something in his tone made my stomach churn as I sat across from him. He slid a document toward me, his expression unreadable. "There's something you need to know," he said, adjusting his glasses. My eyes scanned the page and then I saw it, a clause I hadn't noticed before. If I acted out of malice toward Serafina, Richard stipulated, the remainder of my inheritance would be redirected to charity. The words blurred as tears welled up in my eyes. I left the office in a daze, clutching the paper like it was a death sentence. All those months of plotting, scheming, destroying, had they been for nothing? The family home, the money, everything I had fought so hard to reclaim now belonged not to me but to strangers. For the first time I allowed myself to see the full scope of what I had done. In trying to punish Serafina, I had only punished myself. As I walked back to my car, the weight of Richard's final betrayal settled over me like a shroud. He had known me better than I thought, or perhaps worse. The eviction notice came 2 weeks later, delivered by a polite but firm man in a suit who refused to meet my gaze. I stood in the doorway of the house that had once been my sanctuary, watching as movers packed away furniture and boxed up memories. Each item carried a story: the dining table where we celebrated birthdays, the bookshelf filled with novels Richard never finished reading, the garden bench where I used to sit and watch the sunset. Now they were just things I no longer owned. When the last box was loaded onto the truck, I took one final look around the empty rooms. The walls seemed colder without pictures hanging on them, the floors eerily silent without the echo of footsteps. I locked the door behind me, sliding the key into the envelope provided by the movers. As I drove away, I caught sight of Serafina walking down the street, her arms linked with Sophie's. They looked happy whole. And for the first time I envied them, not because they had won but because they had moved on. A few days after moving into a modest apartment downtown, Serafina showed up at my door. She didn't knock or announce herself. She simply stood there holding a small potted plant wrapped in burlap. "This is for you," she said softly, handing it to me. Her gesture caught me off guard and for a moment I didn't know what to say. We stood in awkward silence until she finally spoke again. "I forgive you, Eleanor. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting." Her words stung, but they also carried a strange kind of grace. Here she was, offering me kindness despite everything I had done to her. I wanted to thank her, to apologize again, but the lump in my throat wouldn't let me speak. Instead I nodded, clutching the plant tightly as if it might anchor me to something solid. When she turned to leave, I called out impulsively, "Why?" She paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Because holding on to anger is exhausting," she replied simply. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the fragile sprig of greenery that symbolized both loss and hope. By winter the stress had taken its toll. I woke one morning feeling weaker than usual, my body heavy and unresponsive. At first I dismissed it as fatigue, but when the symptoms persisted, I reluctantly visited the doctor. The diagnosis came swiftly and mercilessly: congestive heart failure. It wasn't fatal, at least not immediately, but it meant a slower pace of life, one where independence was replaced by reliance on others. As I lay in the hospital bed, staring at the sterile white ceiling, I reflected on the irony of it all. For years I had prided myself on being strong, self-sufficient. Yet here I was, utterly dependent on nurses and medications to keep me alive. Visitors were rare. Most people assumed I preferred solitude. But one day Sophie appeared unexpectedly, clutching a sketchpad and a bouquet of wildflowers. "Mom sent me," she said shyly, setting the flowers on the bedside table. We talked for a while, tentatively bridging the gap between us. By the time she left, I realized something profound. Even broken relationships could heal, given enough time and effort. During my recovery, I began sorting through old belongings stored in the attic of my new apartment building. Among dusty photo albums and forgotten trinkets, I found an envelope addressed to me in Richard's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a letter dated just weeks before his death. "Ellie," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I've left you too soon. I'm sorry for the secrets, the lies, the pain I caused you. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. What I can do is ask for your forgiveness and remind you of one thing: don't let bitterness consume you. Love fiercely, live fully, and find happiness again, even if it's without me." Tears streamed down my face as I read his words over and over, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. For so long I had hated him, blamed him for everything that went wrong. But now, faced with his raw vulnerability, I felt something unexpected: compassion. Perhaps Richard hadn't been perfect, but neither had I. Maybe none of us were. Cradling the letter in my lap, I made a silent promise, to myself, to Richard, to the world, that I would try to live the rest of my life differently. Not perfectly, but authentically. With Richard's letter still tucked safely in my nightstand drawer, I began the painstaking process of writing apologies to everyone I had wronged. Each letter felt like peeling back layers of a wound, painful, raw, but necessary. To Serafina, I wrote about regret and admiration for her resilience. To Sophie, I confessed how wrong it had been to manipulate her trust. To old friends who had drifted away, I admitted my pride had kept me from reaching out sooner. Some letters went unanswered, others returned unopened, but a few brought replies that surprised me. One such reply came from Mrs. Carter, a former neighbor who had always been kind to me, even when others turned their backs. "We all make mistakes, Eleanor," she wrote in her neat cursive. "What matters is whether we learn from them." Her words stayed with me long after I folded the note and placed it beside Richard's letter. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I wasn't defined by anger or guilt. A future built on redemption rather than retribution. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep me moving forward. As the months passed, my health continued to decline, though not as rapidly as the doctors had initially predicted. I spent most of my days sitting by the window in my apartment, watching the world go by and marveling at its quiet beauty. The potted plant Serafina had given me thrived despite my lack of gardening skills, its leaves growing fuller and greener with each passing season. It became a symbol of perseverance, a reminder that life finds a way even in the harshest conditions. One afternoon, while sipping tea and flipping through an old journal, I decided to draft a will of my own. There wasn't much left to leave behind, just a few pieces of jewelry, some books, and the modest savings I'd managed to salvage, but I wanted to ensure they went to people who would appreciate them. To Sophie, I left the pearl necklace Richard had given me on our anniversary. To Serafina, the antique locket that had belonged to my mother. And to Charity, I dedicated whatever remained, hoping it might help someone in need. Writing it all down felt cathartic, like tying up loose ends before stepping into the unknown. On a cool spring morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. The sun streamed through the curtains, casting golden patterns across the floor, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled without effort. My body was weak, yes, but my heart, my weary, battered heart, felt at peace. I spent the day writing one final letter, this time addressed to no one in particular. In it, I poured out everything I had learned about love, forgiveness, and the futility of holding on to grudges. "Life is too short to waste on bitterness," I wrote, my hand trembling slightly. "Find joy where you can and cherish those who matter most." That evening, as twilight settled over the city, I drifted off to sleep clutching Richard's letter. When I woke or didn't wake, I wasn't afraid. My belongings were donated to charity just as I'd requested, and the plant on my windowsill found a new home with Sophie who cared for it tenderly. Though I left this world alone, I hoped my story might serve as a reminder to others. Revenge may feel satisfying in the moment, but true healing comes from letting go. And sometimes the hardest thing to forgive isn't someone else, it's ourselves.